Hello everyone, welcome from Code Village. Today I'm going to talk about another state management solution in Flutter. Previously in my channel I talked on Flutter blog, and today I'm going to talk about Riverpod, which is actually provider. If you already use provider, Riverpod is also provider, but in a different way with a lot more flexibility and freedom. So I'm going to start with the pretty dumb example, which is counter example. And firstly, I have to add this Flutter Riverpod package in the pub/spec.yaml, and then we can proceed now. So this is pretty much the same example, the default Flutter example, but I have changed the text. Actually remove the text, and I have a floating action button, and I'm going to show that counter example here. So in the main.dart file I have my app widget, which is actually a material app, and then as home of this material app I am using my homepage widget. Actually I have separated the code for more readability. So my homepage widget is actually nothing but showing a text at the center and a floating action button. So let's now create a file for our counter. So I'm going to create a file, counter provider .dart. Let's create a counter provider class, counter provider, and then create a variable for the counter. Let's make it private, and create a constructor. And the default value for this counter is, let's say, 10, and also let's make this optional. Okay, cool. Now as it is private, we need to have a getter for this private variable. So let's create that getter in get. Let's name it as counter. Okay, now we have this counter provider. Now as I said earlier, Riverpod is also provider, but with a lot more flexibility. It gives us some other provider. Previously in provider we used to use ChangeNotfier provider or ChangeNotfier, and here we have some other options like state notifier and some more. I'll talk on that later. In this example I'll talk only on ChangeNotfier. So let's one thing here in provider is Riverpod is that we need to have a global variable for our provider. This global variable can be here or in the UI class, UI file, that doesn't matter. Let's create it here. Final counter provider. As it is going to be a ChangeNotfier provider, so let's extend ChangeNotfier here. ChangeNotfier, not from the Cupertino package, but from the foundation. What's wrong here? So we have this one. Okay, pretty good. And now let's have the global variable, which is a ChangeNotfier provider. I'm explaining it in a bit. And from here we need to return our provider, which is counter provider. Okay, So what is this reference? It is actually a provider reference object we have, and we can actually use this for using provider inside provider. That may be a complex example. I'll talk on it maybe in a later video, but let's now keep it simple with the counter example. So we have our counter provider and our counter provider global variable. Now let's proceed with the UI. So how can we read the counter provider from our UI? We have two options. Let me write them. One is using consumer, and another one is extending consumer widget, a special type of widget, consumer widget. So let's now do both of them. Let's now first use the consumer. This builder property takes three parameters. First one is context, second one is a function, and third one optional child. Now we need to have a reference of our counter provider, so let's have it. Can say number provider. We can have this reference by using this watch function and pass the global variable that we created here, which is counter provider. So let's pass that counter provider. Okay, so we have created the reference for our counter provider. Import the file. It's wrong. This should be counter provider dot. Okay, that's okay now. So we have that reference for our provider, and now we can use it to read the counter variable. So let's now show it in a text widget. Return text. We can say counter using consumer. Number provider dot counter. Okay, so we are using that counter provider here, but you may be wondering, we are not providing this counter provider from anywhere. If you used provider earlier, you may be used to use provider widget to provide anything, any change notifier, but we have not used anything like that. But remember, while using Riverpod, we need to wrap material app or the parent widget with a provider scope widget, which is I'm doing now. Provider scope. Yes, we need to do it mandatorily. We need to wrap material app or the parent widget with this provider scope widget. Now this should be okay. Let's now recap once again. We have this counter provider which has a private variable counter. To get this, we have a getter for this, and also we have set this value for this counter as 10 as a default value, and we have the global variable for this counter provider, and we are using it inside a consumer widget, and for that we have the reference for this counter provider, and finally we need to use this provider scope widget as root. Now let's test it. So I have made a hot reload, and as you can see, counter using consumer, the default value 10 is shown here. So we are successfully reading the change notifier provider using this consumer widget, which is the first way of reading provider. The second way is extending consumer widget instead of this stateless or stateful widget. So now let's do that. Instead of stateless widget, we are going to use extend consumer widget. Sorry. And then we're gonna have a second provider reader, scope reader maybe. Yeah, scope reader. Let's name it scope reader. Okay. What's wrong here? Scope provider. So this is actually not a scope provider but scoped reader. So let's use scoped reader. You can say scoped reader. Okay. And then we can have, again similarly, we can have instance of the counter provider using this scope reader. So let's have it final my number provider or number provider. You can say what scope reader, scoped reader, and then pass the global variable that you created here, which is counter provider. So let's use it here and we are good to go. Then inside this text widget I can say counter extending consumer widget. So my num provider dot counter. Okay, let's now see. Yes, as you can see, we are reading the same counter provider by in two way. First one using the consumer, and second one using extending the consumer widget. You can change this variable like 100, like a hot restart. And as you can see, we are reading the change notifier provider using the consumer and also consumer widget. Now how can we change this variable? I mean, how can we write inside the change notifier provider? So for that, let's have a function here, void increment and then let's increment this counter variable plus plus, and to notify the listeners, all the listeners that are using this counter provider, we need to use notify listeners method, which is from this change notifier. And now we can, how can we access, I mean, how can we use this increment function from our UI? Similarly, we have two options here. We can use, let's now see one by one. Let's use another floating action button. So row, I'm using row. So I have added another floating action button here, one for increment and another one for decrement, and we're gonna use two way to write inside the provider. So we already have this increment function. Let's now create the decrement function as well. Decrement, and let's now inside increment I'm going to use this variable to access the increment function, my num provider. So my num provider dot increment. Okay, and for decrementing I am using another way, which is context dot read and then pass the global variable, this global variable counter provider. Let's now pass that counter provider and then decrement. So we are accessing functions in two different ways. One is by using the my number provider instance, and another one is by using context dot read. Let's now see in the app. Yes, it is working. Let's now decrement. Yes, it is working. So let's now recap the whole video. We are using counter provider, which is actually a change notifier provider, and to read the change notifier provider we have two different ways. One is using consumer and another one is by using the extending this consumer widget. We have shown both the way, and similarly we have two ways to write inside the change notifier provider. One is by using the instance change notifier instance, and another one is by using context dot read. Now you may have question when to use consumer and when to extend consumer widget. Excuse me. So this consumer is actually for performance optimization. If you use this consumer, then only the widget that listens to the notifier will rebuild, none other the subtree will be rebuilt. But here with this consumer widget process, all the subtree will be rebuilt. So through this process, using consumer widget, you may optimize the performance. Let's talk again. Here only the widget that depends on this number provider will rebuild if the counter variable changes. None other widget will be rebuilt. I may come up with another video to explain this. So no more today. That's all. Now, as I said earlier, Riverpod comes up with a lot more flexibility. We have other options like provider, state notifier, and lot more. I may come up with all those examples in my future videos. Let's now stop here. So thanks everyone for watching this video. If you like what you saw, please subscribe to my channel and share this video with other Flutter developers. Thank you.